some studies ingest, basically, to see if all of these movies that have different astronauts, if they would actually fit in our spacesuits. He would not. When you look at the crew on the right, everyone would qualify to be an astronaut just from their physical appearance, except for the woman in the back right. There is an age limit for NASA astronauts. Usually we don't take people to become first-time astronauts if they're over the age of 45. We have a couple astronauts that are actually pretty old now. For example, one of my astronauts, I'm working his mission in a couple of years, he'll be 70 years old when he goes to the space station. And so his first flight was in the 90s on the space shuttle. So once you become an astronaut, you can be an astronaut for a long time, but you can't become a new astronaut once you're over the age of 45. So the very first astronauts, you can barely tell them apart. They're all white, they're all military, they're all about the same, right? And so this is in part because a lot of the medical studies that had been done on people at that time were almost entirely focused on men, young men. Those were always the study subjects, and that was going to cause a lot of problems early on, and still causes some problems today when we think about medical treatments and evaluating medical treatments. Because a lot of the data that we originally had on studying these things in humans were specifically in this field. This is the most recent class of astronauts, much more diverse, and they come from a much wider range of backgrounds as well. So whereas all of the other astronauts in the first class, they were all military test fighter pilots, these guys, one's a doctor, two of them were in the military, one is a geologist, one is a psychologist, they do all kinds of different things. So to be an astronaut now, to apply, you need a bachelor's degree in some sort of science field, 2 years of professional experience in that field, and that's it. You don't need to be military, you don't need anything else specifically, and that's sufficient to be an astronaut now. This is the Johnson Space Center in Houston. This is where I work. My favorite building here is this one. I don't do anything inside this building besides grab a beer after work, and you can see the 75 rocket. It's the rocket that took us to the moon back in the 60s and 70s. And it's just a beautiful thing. It's open to the public, you can walk around. And if you ever have a really busy or tiring day, you're just annoyed with people can be annoying, you just go to this building. That's not a person, that's not annoying. That's a cool thing. That's to be run. And of course, the Lego made one, because Lego's awesome. I have 2 of these. And this is my desk, mission control. On the right side, you can see it says surgeon. There's a figurine from Star Trek. These are the different monitors that we look at when we're monitoring the astronauts when they're in space. So not only do we monitor the astronauts, but also the health of the space station overall. We want to make sure the temperature is right, the pressures are right, a lot of different features that we're managing. And this is the neutral buoyancy lab, of the NBL for short. It's the big pool in which we practice all of our spacewalks. The entire space station exists underwater in different pieces in this pool. It's one of the cleanest pools in the world, 45, 50 feet deep. So we do a lot of diving exercises there. And for astronauts in spacesuits, they can practice the spacewalk. It's the most dangerous part of spaceflight, full spacewalk in this pool. That's one of the Canadian astronauts doing it. You can see how many support personnel it takes just for one person. So what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people all supporting. A lot. Another astronaut in the background there. And a lot of the things that we have, Russia has as well. So despite what's going on geopolitically in the world, we still, from a science perspective, are working very closely with Russia. We still fly into space on the Soyuz rocket, which we'll show in a little bit. And we still take care of their astronauts in space medically. So this is their mission control center. This is their training facility called the Yuri Gagarin training facility. And this is their mission control. It looks much more dated than ours. One of the Russian perspectives on spaceflight in general is if it works, don't replace it, don't try to add anything to it. Even the computers here are pretty old, but they get the job done. We also have a pool, a much smaller pool, and it has the parts of the space station that belong for a couple months, just underwater, pretending or simulating what it feels like to be in space, secluded from the world for a long period of time. Can't really go outside. You're in a very the astronauts experience fake gravity, fake microgravity or low gravity, so they can feel a little bit about what it's like to actually be in space. This is what it actually looks like. So every time they get this experience of low gravity, it's only for about 25 to 30 seconds. So plane goes up and then it dives pretty steeply. If you've ever been on a roller coaster that's dropping really quickly, very similar feeling, but this lasts a little bit longer as your whole body's free, not in a restraint system like you are on a roller coaster. So it's pretty fun. I haven't gotten a chance to do it yet. I'm doing it in a couple months. This is one of the crews that flew on a SpaceX mission recently, and everyone that has done it, they seem to be extremely. I'm not allowed to anymore.
The recording will be.
Thank you. Testing, can you hear me? Oh, nice. Does sound better. Great, thank you. So this seems to be really fun. And from those that I've spoken to that have actually done it, they initially it's a little bit you get a little bit nauseous. You don't really want to throw up in this environment because it kind of just floats around and gets on everyone and everything. But seems to be pretty fun. And they had Usain Bolt, fastest man alive, up there to race an old astronaut, and of course Usain Bolt won because he is Usain Bolt. And that brings us to launch. So finishing up astronaut selection. Astronaut selection is pretty extensive in terms of medical evaluations, psychological evaluations. We put a lot of the astronaut candidates through really difficult tasks where they have to work together to come to an adequate solution. And if they do really well on one task, we give them a more difficult task. If they do well on that task, I give them an even more difficult task. And so it selects out pretty strongly because people get frustrated. Patience is something we really look for in the astronauts. But once you finally make it through selection, you get to launch. So this is one of the space shuttles launching. And of course, from the other night, we have the first launch of the Space Launch System, which takes us back to the moon. And what you see in movies a lot, when people go to space on one of these rockets, they're thrown back into their seat and they can't move because of all the G-force. And that really depends on the type of rocket you're actually flying in. And so the big white boosters on the side here, on both of these rockets, those are filled with what we call solid fuel. So if you've ever seen somebody launch rockets in the backyard or even most fireworks, those are filled with solid rocket fuel, and you can't turn them off, you can't slow them down. Once you ignite them, they burn really strongly, really fast, and there's a lot of force. And so if you're going to space on a rocket that has solid rocket fuel, that's the kind you see in movies where you're thrown into your seat and you can't move all of that force. Whereas the rockets we took to go to the moon originally, the Saturn V rocket, which was the one laying down in that big building, that's liquid fuel. And liquid fuel is much more stable, and you can throttle it faster, slower. And the astronauts that went to the moon, they barely felt the rocket launch. They felt a bunch of vibrations, and that was it. They weren't thrown into their seats, felt pretty normal, because that type of fuel is just not nearly as bad in terms of effect on the human body. And so other medical things from this standpoint, in the early days of rocketry, one of the big problems that we didn't even know was a problem was the sound generated by one of these rockets. So if you ever get a chance to see a rocket launch, please do so. And like I said earlier, it was the sound was a visceral shaking experience in my bones. And at the base of the launch pad, those sound waves go down and hit the launch pad and bounce back up into the rocket and cause the whole rocket to vibrate and shake. In the early days, we lost a couple of rockets with nobody in them, but rockets would explode because of the sound waves. So what NASA's solution to that is, and you'll see it sometimes when you're watching a launch online, there will be huge water jets at the base of the rocket That's not to put out fire, it's to absorb the sound waves. So the water can absorb all of that, and there's not nearly as much risk to the rocket itself. These are some of the rockets from history and that we use today. On the far left is the Mercury rocket. That's the very first rocket that America used to send humans into space. And then the Soyuz rocket is right next to it, and that's a rocket that Russia still uses. It's extremely uncomfortable, but it's very safe. And so if it's not broken, why fix it? Then you have a couple other rockets. You have a SpaceX rocket, you have the space shuttle, and this one on the far right, that's what SpaceX is finishing up building now, the Starship rocket, which will be the biggest and strongest rocket ever built once it finally flies. Here's what it looks like right now on the launch pad, doing a lot of testing. It's pretty neat stuff, and this is, again, what I spend the majority of my time working on, the medical systems and the interior layout for this rocket. And one of the neat things, when you actually look at all of these, is on the far left, that rocket could carry 1 human. All of these rockets here can carry 3, maybe 4 humans. Space Shuttle was bigger, could carry 7. And then we took a step back with the Space Launch System, can carry 4 people at most. Depending on the variation of this rocket, it can carry anywhere between 2 people to 200 people in one launch. So if you ever want to go to space, this is the rocket to keep an eye on, because many more people will be able to go to space simply because it can carry so many people. And this is the Soyuz vehicle. On top of that Soyuz rocket is this little guy. It can carry 3 people, and it's extremely tight. That's what they look like. And so they're in this position for 6 to 8 hours. So yes, they're wearing diapers. They all use the diapers. And yeah. Interestingly, the astronauts, they actually prefer this capsule over most of the others because it actually has the best safety record. This type of rocket and capsule has gone to space literally hundreds of times with nobody dying. And no other space company can claim that level of safety yet. There's like a 0.02% chance of dying on this thing, whereas the chance of dying on a space shuttle was 4% for every single flight. And this is the Dragon capsule. It already looks much bigger than the Soyuz. And this is what SpaceX has. And that's the interior of the Dragon capsule. So you compare this to that. Raise your hands for this one. Okay. The safety, okay, I get that. Raise your hands for this one. Yeah, I agree. I would also neglect safety and prefer this one. And so this crew, all of these guys here, none of them are actually professional astronauts. They are all commercial astronauts paid for by this billionaire here in the middle. And interestingly, the first cancer survivor to go to space is this woman on the far right. She's a physician assistant. Her name is Haley. I did the medical training for this crew on their mission. And yeah, they did really well. And of course, Amazon has their own capsule too because it's Amazon. Blue Origin is their company. And when Amazon sends people to space right now, they almost don't count. They go to the edge of space and right back down. They don't go around the Earth. They don't do anything like that. They just touch the tip and come back down. And when you hear of mega millionaires and billionaires going to space, they're usually doing it in this guy. Here's the interior. Big windows, looks pretty, whatever. That brings us to the space station. So most people that go to space, that are professional astronauts, they're going to the space station to do research, to work, to live, to learn more about the human body and how it actually acts in space. Here's the size. It's about the size of a football field, a little bit bigger actually. It is the single most expensive science project that the US has ever undertaken. And if you guys have any questions for me along the way, we'll have a question session at the end, but if you have any questions that are burning and you want to ask right now, just feel free to raise your hand. And of course, China is building their own space station. They've had a couple of space stations in the past, and this is their current one. Have you guys heard of a company called Axiom? A little bit? So Axiom is also building their own space station. And because Amazon is a thing, Amazon's building their own space station. And so once you actually get to space, things are a little bit weird. Have any of you guys seen YouTube videos of this guy in the bottom right? Nice, yeah. So he's a Canadian astronaut, and he does a lot of educational videos on how things work in space, how to wash your hair, how to brush your teeth, how water works in space. One of the interesting things about everybody gathering together like that in the top right is the problem of carbon dioxide. So here on Earth, when you exhale, you breathe out a lot of carbon dioxide. And if you have too much carbon dioxide in your system, you get headaches, you get irritated, you can get pretty sick. And on Earth, when you breathe it out, because gases diffuse into the volume they have, the CO2 leaves very quickly and it's not a problem. In space, or on the space station, there isn't a lot of extra volume around you in the space station, so sometimes that carbon dioxide just sits there. And you can't see it because it's clear, it's invisible, right? And sometimes, when there's a lot of people in one room, the room fills with carbon dioxide, and everyone starts to get headaches and starts to get angry at each other for no reason. And we tell them to literally just leave the room, cool off, and everyone gets better. And sometimes we'll have astronauts that are working in some corner of the space station, or they're walking from one part to another, well, not walking, gliding, and they will run into an invisible bubble of CO2. They're just walking along, or gliding along, and then they just suddenly get an instant headache, instantly angry, because they ran into a bubble of carbon dioxide. And so now we have more fans to prevent that from happening, but kind of a weird problem that you don't have on Earth. Can you hear me in back okay with the mic? That's still okay? All right. So space motion sickness, I mean, that would make most people sick regardless of where you were. But the vast majority of people that go to space get some form of space motion sickness. Some of the other things we do in space is we keep an eye on the ocular health, the eye health of all of our astronauts. Because if you spend enough time in microgravity, you go blind. We don't really know why, but over 6 to 8 months, and it happens to men more than it happens to women, because women's bodies, from a medical perspective, are much better at keeping themselves healthy than in the male body, because the female body overall, evolutionarily, looks to be able to create a new human, right? And so the woman's body is much better at maintaining itself over a long period of time than the male body. So in space, the male body in some aspects seems to break down faster than the female body. And one of the fastest ways we see this actually manifesting is in the eyes. So men's vision deteriorates much faster than women's vision in space. And we don't really know why that is. We know it's a gravity problem because it doesn't happen on Earth, it happens only in space. But we also don't know how much gravity is needed to fix that. So the moon has about 1/6 of the gravity of Earth, and Mars has 1/3 of the gravity of Earth. Is the moon gravity, is that good enough to fix this problem? Is Martian gravity good enough? We have no idea. If you've seen the movie The Martian, the book The Martian, they actually talk about this a little bit. And one of the other weird things is everybody's legs shrink by about 20%, and everybody's penises shrink by about 60%. And the reason for that is because your chest is a negative pressure cavity, so every time you inhale, you're creating negative pressure in your chest to breathe in air. And in space, that negative pressure, it pulls the fluids in the blood from the lower half of the body into the chest. So everybody's chest expands, everybody gets really round-looking faces because of the extra fluid, and the blood that's usually in the legs, blood that's usually in the penis, gets pulled up, and everyone just, that happens. And everything gets back to normal when you're back on Earth, but that happens. And some of the other rapid changes when you get to space, everybody gets taller. You gain about 2 to 3 inches in height when you get to space, and that can cause a lot of back pain. The reason that happens is, so your spine, it has all these bones, right? And between the bones, you have these cushiony vertebral discs. You've heard of people dislocating a disc and having really bad back problems. Well, on Earth, the reason we have those discs is to deal with gravity and prevent the bones from crushing each other. In space, there is no gravity, so those cushions slowly expand, and they expand your spine as well. So everyone gets 2 to 3 inches taller, and then you shrink when you get back to Earth. So musculoskeletal, one of the things that's most commonly heard of, or people think about when you go to space and its effects on the body, is how you lose your muscles. Your bone density decreases because there's no gravity. You're not doing a lot of training, right? And that's absolutely true. And so the way we fix that is we force the astronauts to exercise 2 hours a day, 6 days a week for months. So it's, a lot of the astronauts now actually, they come back with more muscle and more bone density than they first went up there, because very few people here on Earth are exercising 2 hours a day, 6 days a week for months at a time. So we have a stationary bicycle over there. We have a treadmill here for the aerobic stuff. And then for the resistance exercises, we have some pretty interesting machines where you can do squats, you can do bench press, deadlifts, all of those high strength activities. So, have you ever guys had space ice cream? Yes, no, okay. So this is absolutely not what you'd bring to space. This is like the worst food to eat in space. And this is completely a marketing thing. I've had this too when I was a kid. It tastes, whatever. But why, anybody have an idea why this might be bad to actually eat in space? Anybody? There's no moisture in it, to be really dehydrated. Yep, that's one point. Anybody else? Because it's not healthy. We do give the astronauts treats sometimes, but that's very true. We very closely manage all of the food that they intake. Anybody else?
No, I've never had it, but it looks like it's gonna be like crunchy. It's like maybe crumbs getting everywhere.
That's the winner. So all these other points are very true, but that is the main point. And so we actually have a metric we use called the crumb coefficient. So every food item has a specific crumb coefficient, and if that crumb coefficient is too high, we don't fly it in space. And the reason for that is if there are a lot of crumbs floating around, here on Earth, crumbs fall to the ground, you sweep it away, that's fine. But in space, the crumbs that are floating around, they get in everybody's eyes. And you get people having foreign bodies in their eyes all the time, or you inhale it. Do you really want to be snorting that? I mean, no. So it causes a lot of problems, and so the more crumbs there are, the worse that food is. That's why most food in space comes prepackaged and looks not nearly as appetizing. So crackers, yeah, somebody said crackers. Crackers do have a very high crumb coefficient, so the only way they're allowed to eat crackers is in one bite. You're not allowed to bite it in half, whole thing in your mouth at once. And so they do have some somewhat unhealthy items. So you can see some shortbread cookies, some, quote, candy-coated peanuts, because we're not allowed to use brand names. So they're not M&Ms. We actually take the kitchens at NASA, they actually take each M&M, scratch off the M on it, and package it, because so there are M&Ms. I didn't tell you that, but there are M&Ms. And so because NASA's a public institution, we don't want to be favoring one company or another unless we're giving them a specific contract. And we don't give Nestle, Hershey, whomever owns M&M these days, we don't give them a contract for the M&Ms. So somebody goes to the store, buys a bunch of M&Ms, like Costco, just a huge batch of M&Ms, and takes them home, or not home, into our sterile food lab, it's a very impressive food lab, and scratches off the M's. That's literally somebody's job, to scratch the M's off the M&Ms. Nice. And so sometimes they get special food items. So there's pizza in space. It's not the most appetizing looking pizza, but when you've been living on this for weeks, months at a time, pizza's really nice. And this is one of my favorite pictures. These dude's just chilling, and you can see the curvature of the Earth. So yes, it is curved in the background. And you can see a whole bunch of different foods. When it comes to drinks like juice and coffee, if you prefer your coffee a very specific way, or you prefer a very specific type of juice, they will pre-package and pre-make all of that for you here on Earth, and then send it up. So if you have some crazy Starbucks order that is, I get like black coffee or vanilla latte, and that's it. But let's say it's like a 15, 20 syllable Starbucks order, they will take that and make that for you on Earth, turn it into powder, send it to space. So you add water to it later on. You can see some trail mix here. There's a Rice Krispie treat over there, which we don't call it a Rice Krispie treat, of course. There is a Cliff Bar over there that actually does seem to have packaging on it still, which would be frowned upon, actually. And of course, what goes in must come out, right? So this is what the astronauts from the Apollo era that went to the moon, that are legends of exploration and some of the models for humanity, all that stuff. This is what they had to poop in. And so literally they taped a bag to their butts and they pooped. And if you listen to some of the public audio recordings from those missions, some of the problems were prior to including these, see, germicide little pouches in the bottom. So because by weight, go ahead. Question? Huh? It's to wipe yourself. Yeah, you get one finger to wipe. And so part of the problem, or can anybody think of any problems with this type of bag? Go ahead. Here, quiet down for a sec. Go ahead. Seems not very sanitary. I completely agree. Yeah. Any other problems? Go ahead. A little bit louder. Might be difficult to close. That is another one of the cardinal problems with this bag. And so something that would affect the difficulty to close is the fact by weight, every time you poop, a third of the weight of your poop is pure bacteria. Like a third of it, a full third is just bacteria. So that bacteria is still alive, it's still producing gas. And so if you close this bag without killing that bacteria, the poop still produces gas. And if you have lots of gas being produced in an enclosed space, that bag's gonna pop. And so you can see where I'm going with this. So when we were orbiting the moon, even the first time we landed on the moon, there are audio recordings of Neil Armstrong and the other guys from several different Apollo missions talking about, oh, somebody's shit is floating around in the cabin. And they would identify it based on like what that person ate. This person ate, a power bar with corn in it. Oh, this was Jim Lovell, this was yours, like. And so those audio recordings, you can access them on Wikipedia. Go ahead. Where do you put the bag? So there's a lot of engineering solutions to that. So there's an enclosed container that gets locked and gets disposed of later on. Urine was actually ejected into space during the Apollo era, but stool was kept in a special box. And then it was evaluated later by physicians like me to make sure it was healthy poop. Yeah, that wasn't caught floating around. I think somebody over here had a question. You had one? Okay, yeah. So that's always interesting. And of course, we have other things in space. And so some of the problems, in the early days of NASA, there were virtually no female engineers. And there were no female physicians, absolutely not. And when it came to sending females in space for the first time, there didn't seem to be a single male that had ever asked a woman what happens during her period. And so for one woman that they sent on a space shuttle for 1 week, guess how many tampons and pads they included? 5, 100, no, higher. They included 10,000 pads on tampons. So NASA's done some pretty great things, but they've also made a lot of key mistakes, and that being one of them. And so one of the biggest problems for the engineers was when they decided to send 2 women to space. Like, oh my God, do we send 20,000 tampons and pads? And so clearly, a lot of these engineers, they had wives, right? They had daughters, but they never asked a single one of them what happens. And so when they finally started doing some math, they even did the math wrong, and they were estimating that the average woman during her period is going to lose about 1 liter to 1.5 liters of blood. And a female body only has about 3 to 4 liters of blood in it, period. No pun intended. And so basically, these engineers were estimating that a woman loses 1/3 of the blood in her body every month, which is obviously incorrect. So it took NASA a while to get that correct. And so moving from the gynecology side of things to the urology side of things, and so one of the things that affects actually both men and women in space is what we call urinary retention. One of the things that triggers you to pee on Earth is your bladder gets really, really full, and you have sensors on the bottom of your bladder that can tell when your bladder is getting too big. When your bladder gets too big, you feel that urge to go pee, so you go and pee. In space, because there's no gravity, the urine kind of collects everywhere, and those sensors, it takes a lot more urine in your bladder to trigger that feeling of, oh, I need to pee. And so what happens sometimes is if the bladder gets too full, the urethral opening in the bladder gets blocked off. And so you can't pee. And that's just a cycle that gets worse and worse. The only way to fix that is to put a tube in your penis or in your urethra to get rid of that urine. happens to men more than women because, again, men seem to break down faster than women in space. And so we've, about 5-6 times, we've had to put in these catheters in space. Catheters in space, could be a talk in and of itself. And so all of this to say, and we'll talk about a few other medical things, but medicine in space, or the human body in space, is just very different. So I take care of people in an emergency room as well, also working on an ER, and so I take care of a lot of people who are unhealthy and have all kinds of accidents and they come to the emergency room. In space, it's the opposite. I'm taking care of extremely healthy people that have space problems. And actually, while we're on this, I'll talk a little bit about reproduction in space. So there have been a couple of people in space that have been intimate with each other, and it's always, that's all I'm going to say about that. But when it comes down to having a baby in space, for example, there have been a lot of movies that have talked about the implications for a developing baby in the womb. For example, the part of pregnancy in which the baby's at most risk to things like the mother drinking wine, the mother smoking, or radiation, is that first trimester, especially the first 4 to 6 weeks. That's the most important time for the developing fetus. And in space, all that radiation in the background, that could cause a lot of problems for the developing baby. And then, of course, if the woman carries the baby to term and actually has the baby, the musculature of the baby is going to be completely different than here on Earth. Because here on Earth, the baby at least grows up with a sense of gravity. Despite floating in all the fluid inside the uterus, they still get that sense of gravity and develop that sort of musculature. But in space, that isn't present. So there are some movies that do a good job, or the show The Expanse, I forget what network that's on. They have some people on that show that live in the asteroid belt and grew up with no gravity. And they are much longer, much lankier, and have very poorly defined muscles. And that's pretty accurate as to what would happen. And here's the diaper that the women wear. Lots of layers. Can hold up to almost a full liter of urine. And when they're on spacewalks, everyone has diapers as well. And they're told to not pee too much in your space diaper, because if you fill the space diaper too much, it overflows. And if you're in a spacesuit, you get pee floating around in your boots and in your helmet, and that's frowned upon. Here's the male diaper. It has what we call a condom catheter. So you slide that over your penis, and if it falls off, that's okay. But otherwise, it's pretty similar to the rest of the female diaper. We'll talk very briefly on immunology. And so in space, different parts of your immune system start to fail at different rates, and we're not entirely sure why. Radiation, we think, is a small component. But the same cells that get destroyed when you have HIV or AIDS are the same cells that break down in space very quickly. And so when people come back from space, especially during COVID, we actually put the astronauts into quarantine just to make sure just to wait until the cells came back to normal. So the longer you are in space, the more your immune system starts to break down. So even if you've had, let's say you had chickenpox as a kid or some other disease that you're now immune to, if you have something like chickenpox, it still stays in your system for the rest of your life. It's just suppressed by your immune system. So we've had a couple people actually get chickenpox on the space station because their immune system was so suppressed, the chickenpox that had been quiet for years now could overcome the immune system and come back. So we're still, and this is just for 6 to 8 months in space. So you think about something like a Martian mission. So to go to Mars, it takes about 4 to 5 months to get to Mars. You can only go to and from Mars every 2 to 3 years. Because so you have the sun here in the middle, you have Earth and you have Mars. You can only go between the planets when Earth and Mars are on the same side of the sun. Because if they're on opposite sides of the sun, it takes much, much longer to get between the planets. So you have to wait 2 years until the planets are next to each other to actually go to each other. So you think about how much your immune system is going to degrade over 2 years. And again, we don't know if gravity is what fixes that, if protecting against radiation fixes that. A lot of questions that we still don't have answers to. Hematology, or study of the blood. Blood clots. People get more blood clots in space because different parts of your vasculature don't work nearly as well. For example, in your lower legs, all of the veins in your lower legs have valves. Valves that help pump the blood back up to your heart. So every time you take a step, or every time you activate any of the muscles in your legs, those valves automatically close, or automatically pump blood back up to your heart. In space, you're not using those valves because there's no gravity. You're not stepping on anything. And so you're much more likely to get blood clots because of that. We've had 3 astronauts with blood clots in space so far. Psychology. Psychology is a huge component of what we do in space. For example, you're away from your family, you're away from your friends for weeks, months, up to a year at a time, and you're in a very isolated place, protected from the vacuum of space by a few millimeters of steel or aluminum, and it can be pretty lonely, pretty stressful. And so NASA has a program called the BHP, the Behavioral Health Program, to help astronauts deal with all the stress and the difficulties of that. One of my favorite aspects is in terms of family and friend support. So astronauts can talk to their family every single day on a cell phone. Like, you literally get a call from space. I've gotten a few calls on my own cell phone from space. The first time it happened, I thought it was somebody like prank calling me, and I hung up on him. Then I get a call from Mission Control saying, hey, that was an astronaut trying to call you from space. Like, oh. So you talk to your family every day, and then you can have a video call with your family every week. And every 6 to 8 weeks you're in space, the astronauts get a video call to any person in the world they will reach out to and ask if they want to talk to an astronaut. So people like Barack Obama, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, the Pope, astronauts will say, hey, can I talk to the Pope? And NASA will reach out to the Pope and say, hey, do you want to talk to an astronaut? And they'll arrange a call, and to date, nobody has turned down a call from the astronauts, except me when I hung up on one. But so in one of the back rooms at NASA, we actually have a tally board going for the different celebrities and influencers or musicians that have been contacted by the astronauts. And so Michelle Obama has been called more times than Barack Obama. I think that the leading composer, it's been called more than anybody else, is, oh my gosh, did the Interstellar soundtrack and Pirates of the Caribbean. I'm blanking. Hans Zimmer, thank you, yes. He's been the most contacted composer. John Paul II was the most contacted of the popes, but lots of psychological support, including movies. So when the new Star Wars movie came out, the astronauts in space were the first ones to see it, aside from people that worked on the movie themselves. And none of the astronauts really liked the movie, but that's not part of this talk. There are a lot of instruments in the space station too, because a lot of these astronauts, they are incredible multitaskers, and they've done all kinds of things with their lives. And so there have been a couple of bands that have gotten together on the space station. And all of the astronauts' favorite place on the space station is what we call the cupola window. This is a special window on part of the space station where you can go to and take pictures of the Earth. It's very relaxing, it's very quiet, and interestingly, it's the only location in the space station where you get the highest amount of what we call phosphenes. So phosphenes it's a phenomenon in which a particle from some star that exploded millions, billions of years ago flies through space and activates a single nerve inside your eye, triggering a flash of light. And so when they're in this part of the space station and their eyes are closed, they see like a light show. Like every 7 to 8 seconds, they'll see a red flash, a green flash, a white flash, a blue flash. And so far, we don't think it causes any problems. But it's a known phenomenon. And at first, the people that had the highest incidence of that were the astronauts on the far side of the moon when they were orbiting the moon. And they weren't protected at all by Earth's atmosphere, and they were on the far side of the moon, so they weren't protected by the mass of the moon. So there was a higher incidence of that. And of course, at the time, the Apollo astronauts, they reported 0 problems at all times, despite poop floating around and all these other things. They reported nothing because they wanted to go to space again. And if I tell you there's a problem, maybe you're going to think I caused the problem and you won't send me back. Nowadays, we have a much more open conversation with the astronauts, so we're aware of everything that is happening. But phosphenes, yeah, they're a thing. And it happens more in this part of the space station because there's very little shielding against radiation here. Sleeping on the space station, it depends on how many people are actually on the station. Nowadays, there's usually about 6 to 7 people on the space station, so they all have their own little cubbies to sleep in. But if there's too many people, you literally just tape your bed to a wall and sleep. And usually they wear some sort of like eye mask, so the lights don't bother them. So environmental hazards. This is inside that Soyuz vehicle, the really, really cramped capsule we looked at before. It doesn't look as cramped now when they're out of their spacesuits. So this is Scott Kelly, an astronaut that was in space first astronaut in space for a year. And even to sit in his seat, he's like in a fetal position, all curled up. And 3 people sit here. It's safer, but your back's gonna hurt. And so again, space radiation, the sun is a deadly laser, right? So the Earth does a good job of protecting us from that, but in space, can cause more problems. So you think of things like solar flares. There's an entire department at NASA dedicated to space weather. So one of the cool things about working for NASA is you get daily space weather updates on your phone about the status of the sun, what kind of particles are flying towards Earth, because we have satellites in between Earth and the sun to measure those things. So that's yet another concern. And when we talk about settling on the moon or settling on Mars, to protect yourself from the radiation on the moon, you have to have the same amount of radiation on the surface of the moon that you're getting right now, just sitting here in this room. You need to be 13 feet underground to protect yourself from space radiation. That's to have the same equivalent radiation in space or on the moon that you would have here. So there's a lot of work to be done there as well. One of the other concerns from an environmental perspective is there are different gases that are used inside the space station, different liquids. For example, ammonia. Ammonia is used to cool off different parts of the space station as a cooling fluid. And if you've ever smelled like smelling salts that are really good at waking you up, that's basically the smell of ammonia. And ammonia can be really toxic to humans in high doses. And so we have a lot of procedures and protocols in place to help the crew through that. And interestingly, what do you guys see in this picture, first of all? Besides some white things. So basically, these are a couple of spacesuits covered in gray material. And that's moon dust. And one of the biggest engineering problems, and even medical problems for when we go back to the moon, is actually moon dust. And the problem with moon dust is, you think about dust here on Earth, or even sand here on Earth. Anything on Earth has been exposed to centuries or millennia of wind, rain, a lot of shearing forces that smooth out those particles, often into really nice, smooth, round particles. And those sand falls off your clothing usually. Whereas in space, the dust on the moon, it's been sitting there for literally billions of years, and the only thing touching it has been meteorite impacts, and meteorite impacts that happen on the moon cause a lot of glass to be generated because they melt everything. So about 50% of moon dust is glass. And so not only do you have meteorites impacting it, but you have no wind, you have no rain, nothing to smooth out those particles. You do have the sun hitting it all the time, which makes the dust slightly charged and magnetic. So all these moon dust particles, they're extremely jagged, they're mostly made of glass, and they're kind of magnetic, so they stick to you. And really hard to get off of things. They get inside all kinds of machinery. And we actually took some x-rays of these astronauts when they came back from the moon, and they had moon dust in their lungs. It looked like very mild pneumonia for a couple of them, or pneumonitis, which is inflammation of the lungs in different parts of the lungs. And that was all because of the moon dust. And so as we prepare to go back to the moon, and we have a spaceship that's orbiting the moon now, we're trying to think of new ways to protect against that. And so when we have that Axiom company I mentioned before, they're building one of our new spacesuits, and we have a lot of requirements that we're giving them to protect against moon dust. And of course, one of the most dangerous things we do, called EVAs, or extravehicular activities, or spacewalks. So this is on the space station. You can see all the different handholds they use. And the legs for these spacesuits actually don't move at all. So when you're on the space station outside doing a spacewalk, you only use your hands. So you get a lot of shoulder injuries, a lot of wrist injuries, because you're moving a lot of weight, your own weight. And that might sound a little counterintuitive because there's no gravity, so it's easy to move around. While yes, it's easy to move around, momentum is still a thing. So momentum is mass times velocity. So the faster you are moving a certain amount of mass, the more momentum there is that you have to stop. So that inertia keeps going. So stopping all of that momentum, you still have to use your muscles to do that, and cause a lot of musculoskeletal injuries on top of that. Does this give anybody any concerns, just dangling off the edge of the space station? They have that, that little tether right there, keep them safe. This is the Canada arm. It's an inchworm-like robotic arm that can move along the space station and hold astronauts at the same time. Yeah, this one even gives me a little bit of anxiety. This is the farthest an astronaut has been from the space station. It's almost a kilometer away. And he was in his little jetpack. He said he had a great time. He was a freak, but And that brings us to spacesuits. Actually, I'm going to get a quick drink. Hold on. spilled on myself. Nice. Cool. All right, so these are a few of the new spacesuits that NASA uses. And so there's two types of spacesuits. There's the spacesuit that you use inside the vehicle, like during launch and landing, and there's the spacesuit that you use during a spacewalk. So these are spacesuits that you would use inside the vehicle. They're pressure suits, and each one costs about $1 million to make. And which one do you guys like more? Hands for the one on the far left? All right, so Stormtrooper, okay. And in the middle? Hands for the one in the middle? Wow, okay. And hands for the one on the far right. Nice. And so this is the Russian spacewalking suit, and it's pretty unique because you actually climb into it from behind. So a door opens up in the back, and you walk into it. Very different from the American spacesuit, which is this one, which you see in all the movies and stuff. There's a lot of different parts. It takes much longer to put this guy on than to put this guy on. Because you literally walk into this, close the door, power it up. Excuse me, that's it. Whereas here, it's quite the process. And you can see on the far left, they wear a liquid cooling garment underneath to keep the bodies nice and cool, because it gets really hot inside these things. And then, of course, the newest spacesuits that Axiom is building, that's a model of what it'll look similar to the one on the far left, but it won't be nearly as grotesquely patriotic, fortunately. And this is what the vital signs look like for the spacesuit. So you think of in a hospital when you're hooked up to a monitor, you get heart rate, you get blood pressure, things like that. These are all the things we look at for the spacesuit. So the pressure in different parts of the spacesuit, temperature in different parts, the different types of air inside, the thermal regulation capabilities, lots of different facets that we're evaluating at the same time. Then we have a hyperbaric chamber or a pressure chamber at NASA as well, if anybody gets any sort of decompression illness or the bends from diving in the big pool. Then I'll go quickly through these slides, more for a medical audience, but these are some examples of the medical equipment we have in the space station. So the space station has a pretty extensive medical system, to be honest. You can't do x-rays or CT scans or anything like that, but we do have an ultrasound up there, which we can use, a lot of medications. And when it comes to medicine in space, there are a lot of medications that just don't work in space, and we don't entirely know why. There's a couple antibiotics that break down extremely quickly in space, and we can barely use them. We can use them for about a week, and then the radiation, or being in space in general, breaks it down to the point where it's unusable. So keep that in mind when we try to plan for missions to Mars or long-duration stays on the moon. We can't make medicine work long enough in some cases. You get your eye chart, a bunch of random things. Here's our list of antibiotics that do work for the most part. Bunch of stuff. So this guy looks like he's stretching, but he's actually doing CPR or practicing CPR in space. So the best way to do CPR in space is literally upside down. Because if you've ever done any sort of CPR course or seen CPR in the movies, everyone is always patients on the ground and somebody who's doing chest compressions is on top of them, driving with their upper body and their abdomen to do the compressions. That gets very tiring very quickly if you've ever actually done CPR. So in space, the best way to do it is to use your legs. Your legs are much stronger than your abdomen, much stronger than your shoulder. So you strap the patient down to the board, put your feet on the ceiling, and do your chest compressions. Seems to be having a jolly good time doing it. And this is a $10,000 backboard that we use in case we need to actually do CPR. And so the reason it costs so much is because it manages the electricity from somebody getting shocked during CPR. So you've seen in the movies, or if you've done a CPR course, they say stand back and they shock the patient. Well, the space station is full of very sensitive electrical equipment. So you don't want all of that extra energy just spreading around and ruining equipment. So this backboard manages that extra shock. Here's practicing how to do CPR again. And this is on one of those parabolic or zero-G flights that go up and down. This is practicing how to put in an airway, so intubating somebody, putting in a breathing tube in their mouth. And the best way to do it is how he's demonstrating. So you would actually float off the ground, somebody would help brace the patient, and you keep the patient's head and neck still between your knees to put in the breathing tube. This is a guy trying another way to put in a breathing tube, which is just wrong. Then surgery in space. Surgery in space is something that we've done a little bit of research on. Did a lot more research in the 80s and 70s. But surgery is like the last thing you want done in space. You want to prevent any of that from happening. Some people will talk about how maybe we should get our appendix taken out before we go to space, right? To make sure that nobody's going to get appendicitis in space. Well, the problem with cutting into somebody's belly is, well, one, you're cutting into somebody's belly that has its own risks. But whenever you take out any organ from the belly, you have a risk in the future of getting something we call adhesions. So adhesions are basically strips of tissue in the abdomen that form as scar tissue after any sort of surgery. And so those adhesions can later on pinch off part of your intestines and cause you to not be able to have a bowel movement as the stool backs up, and can cause a lot of problems. So on one hand, sure, you could take out their appendix and remove the risk of appendicitis, but you increase the risk of adhesions causing problems later on. So it's, which is worse? It's hard to tell. And so some of the problems with surgery in space is blood is going to get everywhere, right? Because there's no gravity, so it floats around. One of the nice things about fluids in space is the surface tension. So when there is bleeding, it kind of tends to stick to the surface of whatever is bleeding from and just forms like a bubble or a dome around the wound. But here they're practicing surgery in or surgical techniques on one of those zero-G flights again, just to see how things actually are managed. Like I said, ultrasound, and everyone's doing a lot of ocular or eye ultrasound because, again, the eye deteriorates, and we're still trying to figure out why specifically that happens. We do ultrasounds of the neck to make sure there's no blood clots in the vessels in the neck. Then, of course, coming back to Earth. That's the other really dangerous phase of flight. So on the left, you have a couple of SpaceX rockets landing like out of a movie. And then on the right, you have the Soyuz capsule coming back to Earth. And so the Soyuz capsule hasn't changed in about 30 years. It's the exact same thing. When it lands, it's like a 20 mile per hour car crash, and it just slams into the mountainside. And you've probably seen in the news before where a space shuttle flight or some rocket recently was delayed because it was too windy out, it was too cloudy out. For whatever reason, they couldn't launch because there was a single cloud in the sky. The Soyuz rocket, it launches in blizzards. It's a machine. It can do all kinds of stuff. It works really well, so the Russians haven't changed it. And this capsule has landed in the middle of blizzards on the sides of mountains. This capsule used to carry a pistol inside to protect against wolves that might be in those mountains. So there are legendary stories, and it's hard to tell which ones are actually true sometimes. There is one story where the Soyuz capsule landed like 3 hours from the landing site, so the astronauts had a little bit of time to hang out, and nobody had ever used the pistol before, and so they went outside, and the Russian cosmonaut and the American astronaut did shooting practice on a tree. And of course, the Russian and the American, they both say they were the better shot, but so that's the only time the pistol has actually been fired. And they no longer carry the pistol because we're trying to keep space as gun-free as possible, right? But for a long time, there was a pistol in that capsule. And so when astronauts come back from space, so this guy that they're carrying, he is a former Navy SEAL and the picture of health. But in this picture here, he looks very pale, despite his thumbs up. He's got probably the most grimmest looking smile I've ever seen. So he was in space for about 6 months. And when you come back, all of those medical changes that we talked about, all the blood flow going from your legs up into your torso, all of that immediately starts to reverse when you get back to Earth-like gravity. And so the body will feel extremely dehydrated because all of that extra fluid that was pulled into your torso, all that extra fluid now is going back to your legs. Your legs are coming back to normal size, your penis is coming back to normal size, and now you're super lightheaded because all that blood, all that fluid is now no longer in your upper body. And so a lot of these astronauts, when they get back, they get really dizzy, they get nauseous sometimes, they get close to passing out, and sometimes they even do pass out. And so it takes a team to recover these astronauts from long-duration spaceflight. And this is the SpaceX recovery ship when they pick people up out of the water. There's a helicopter pad on top. And again, here's pulling a capsule out of the water. And yeah, this is Haley. This is the cancer survivor, the physician assistant that went to space. And the guy on the far left is Anil Menon. He was the medical director at SpaceX. He's graduated the same program that I did maybe 7, 8 years ago. And he's an astronaut now for NASA. So emergencies in space, we'll go over this pretty quickly. But these are your heroes, the legendary Apollo astronauts. So NASA had a lot of problems with the spacesuits, and I mean, they're tripping over the smallest of things. And this isn't sped up or slowed down, this is real time. And so there were a lot of musculoskeletal injuries, a lot of bruises, a lot of scratches. So when people say, like, we haven't been to the moon, you show them this GIF, which is freely available online, and like, why would NASA fake something like this? Like, they look pretty. So being outside in space has all kinds of risks. Can anybody think of some of the problems with being in space, besides the medical stuff we talked about? So one of the biggest things are asteroids, meteors, micrometeoroids. And so that is a tiny puncture in one of the windows on the space station. And so even particles that are the size of a grain of sand, the minimum speed for something to stay in orbit of Earth is about 17,000 miles per hour. So anything that's going to hit the space station is going at least 17,000 miles per hour. So you think about the dart from a Nerf gun. If that hits you, not going to hurt much because it's maybe going 10 meters a second at the very most, so 35 feet per second. Whereas something hits you going 17,000 miles per hour, it's going to puncture most things. And so here's a little, see if this GIF works. So that is every object that we're currently tracking greater than 1 millimeter or a grain of sand in space. And this was as of 2010, and there's exponentially more things in space now. These are the ones we can track. And the space station orbits in that little blue fuzz area around the Earth. And everything out here, this is the level of what we call geostationary satellites. This is a lot of junk and debris out there. If you guys have seen the movie WALL-E, when WALL-E first goes to space, the rocket punches through a layer of just dead debris and satellites. And we're not at that point yet, but becoming more and more of a problem. Then, of course, if you've seen the movie Apollo 13, that was one of the worst medical scenarios we had, where one of the crew members got a really bad kidney infection because he hadn't been peeing for a while. The Apollo 13 mission had all sorts of problems, if you've seen the movie. But he was extremely dehydrated. When he got back to Earth, his heart rhythm was not a perfectly normal rhythm. And his kidneys, he needed lots of antibiotics. So that's one of the other problems with the urinary retention, like we talked about earlier. If that urine stays there in the bladder for long enough, it will get infected and can cause kidney problems. If you get kidney problems, that can cause whole body problems. That's why we try to fix those things as quickly as we can. This guy, his name is Luca Parmitano. He's a good-looking Italian astronaut from the European Space Agency, and he holds the award for almost drowning in space. So you think about going on boats and or going swimming and afraid of drowning. Well, he almost drowned in space because during his spacewalk, that undergarment that we talked about before, that cooling garment, is liquid cooled. There's a little bit of a leak in back, and the water started hitting the back of his neck. And that has happened in the past, and it's not really been an issue. But for him, the water kept leaking out. And so to get back into the space station when you're doing a spacewalk takes, at a minimum, 40 minutes to get back inside and repressurize and take off your spacesuit. At a minimum, 40 minutes in the best of scenarios. And so he was outside in the spacewalk, and he started feeling this water, and he started to make his way back in, but the water kept on coming out. So the water was first hitting the back of his neck, and then because of surface tension, the water kind of just stays there. And more water kept coming out, so the water started moving over his head, started to cover his forehead. And he would try to shake his head, but the water would stay there because of surface tension. The water started covering his eyes, and he reported to Mission Control that he can barely see now because the water is covering. And so it's not like the water was, his helmet didn't become a fishbowl. He was almost wearing a water helmet made entirely of water, just sticking to his neck, head, and face. Then the water started to cover his nose. And by the time it covered his nose, he was already back inside the space station, but they were in the process of repressurizing, so he couldn't take off the spacesuit, because if he took off the spacesuit in that moment, he would die from the lack of pressure. Then the water started to cover his mouth. And at that point, he just started drinking it. There was nothing else he could do at that point. He had about 5 minutes left before the pressure would be safe enough for him to take off his helmet. He drank about 2 liters of water in those last 5 minutes to stop himself from drowning. Then finally got off the helmet, and the rest of the astronauts came by, or were there with paper towels and everything. They dabbed it off, and he was fine. And he tells the story all the time publicly, and he said it was quite the experience, and he actually just came back from space again recently. So he's still an active astronaut, but we have all kinds of protocols and procedures in place now to deal with something like this. The spacesuit has been somewhat redesigned to prevent this from happening again. But yeah, someone almost drowned in space. One of the last ways you would think of dying in space. And your ambulance in space is, again, a little Soyuz vehicle. You get cramped, that really cramped, being packed in to go back to Earth. Or the Dragon capsule, a little more room. And these things don't have medical equipment like an ambulance here on Earth does, right? It's very limited capability. It's hard to carry a lot of IV fluids in space because fluid weighs a lot, right? There's a lot of mass to that. And when you're launching off the ground or doing anything in space, mass is one of the most important factors. So you can't really carry much in terms of medical equipment and fluids. And so, of course, we're going back to the moon, right? And this is what SpaceX plans to land on the moon. Again, this is what I spend most of my time working on. And you can see the size of the humans on the bottom. So it's basically landing a building on the surface of the moon. And I think it looks pretty cool. When you compare it to the other things that have landed on the moon in the past, so the far left, that's the lunar module from the Apollo era. That's the size of what we landed on the moon in the past, compared to what we plan on landing now on the far right. The middle two items are a couple other people that competed for the contract, which SpaceX won on the far right. But of course, Amazon competed to that second one from the right, because of course they did. And then of course, after that is Mars. And so some people say we should go to Mars first, which to me is a little bit silly medically. We want to figure out how to do everything on Mars on the moon first. It's kind of like going to the South Pole. You have to first go somewhere that's not the South Pole, like McMurdo Station, which is on the edge of Antarctica, practice everything there first, get everything right there, and then go into the South Pole. And Mars is exponentially more difficult than the moon. To get back from the moon, you can get back from the moon in about 3 days. That's about the time frame. So if something really bad was happening, you can technically get home in 3 days. But like we said before, getting back from Mars is anywhere between 4 months and 2 years, depending on where the planets are in space. So when we do go to Mars, one, they're going to need to send a doctor with, and they're going to need to have much more medical equipment and probably the healthiest people. And even from a psychology perspective, what type of people do you send to Mars? Do you send 4 men, 4 women? Should they all be the same religion? So should they all be the same gender? Should they be married? Should they be single? All these questions we don't really have answers to, but these people are going to be in cramped quarters for years together. Even if you've had a best friend since kindergarten, you still don't live with that best friend since kindergarten. And even if you do, you guys still argue sometimes. And you don't want to have severe arguments happening in one of these types of missions. And on top of that, do you send an even number of people or an odd number of people? Let's say you send 4 people, and there's an argument, and you have 2 versus 2, and that argument never gets resolved. So maybe you send an odd number of people, so there's always somebody to break the tie. It's, again, questions we don't have good answers to yet. This is SpaceX's very ambitious plan for Mars. And this little layout completely ignores the concerns for radiation, the concerns for a lot of things, actually. But it looks pretty. It's a little bit more realistic. And again, they're using their Starship, their building-sized vehicle, to land on Mars. So that's all I have. Thanks for coming by. I really like talking about space. I'll give you guys my email address if you want it. But yeah, if you have any other questions, go for it. Yep. What do you do to entertain yourself in space? So the astronauts, they work, and part of the reason I wouldn't want to be an astronaut in the space station is because they're working so much, and they're following protocols and procedures from the time they wake up to the time they go to sleep. They do have, like, in a couple of pictures, instruments. They do like taking pictures of the Earth. They do like calling family and friends. Some of them have brought Game Boys up to space. So there's the ability to play video games on space isn't like, you can't sit down and play 4 or 5 hours. It's more of a, I'll catch one Pokemon in Pokemon Yellow, and that's about it. So, a question over here somewhere? Does NASA believe in aliens? That's we'll say NASA's investigating the possibility of that, right? So NASA actually just came out publicly with a pretty significant investigation into those, because there are a lot of things that NASA has seen that we can't explain, but extravagant claims require extravagant evidence, right? So you can't just say, oh, that's an unidentified flying object and assume it's aliens. Yeah, Do I think UFOs are a thing? Oh, for sure. But the definition of a UFO is literally an unidentified flying object. I'm not going to make the leap and say, oh, I don't know what it is, therefore it's aliens. Like, that's a huge jump. So NASA, even before making a claim like that, they need to have evidence that it actually is something like an alien. Behind you? Does it smell different in space? That's a great question. It actually does. And so when you're inside any of the spacesuits or any of the vehicles, the astronauts describe it as a burnt metallic smell, like a burnt metal. And it's something I've never personally smelled, so I can only use the adjectives that they use. But yeah, burnt like tangy metal. And we don't really have a good reason for that. The inside of the space station itself smells kind of funky. It's been up there for 20 years and 300 people have lived inside it. So there are things growing in certain places, and they disinfect the place all the time, but it has an older, tangy, metallic smell to it. Weird. Anybody else? No? Go ahead. Oh, yeah. So when I look at the concept of aliens, I look at it from a mathematical approach. I mean, we're one planet around one star, and how many stars are there? Almost all stars have planets. And if you look at the Milky Way alone, there's, I forget how many billion stars in the Milky Way, and there are 1 trillion galaxies. Yeah, just mathematically, I'm not saying there's, intelligent life out there. I have no idea. But there's got to be something living somewhere, even if it's, we find proteins and we find amino acids on asteroids. So if there are amino acids on asteroids, which are the basic building blocks of DNA and RNA, there's probably something else somewhere. But again, I have no proof yet. Happy to wait. So, sure. Sure. Mm-hmm. So the question, how many astronauts has the U.S. had overall? So it's less than 1,000 in total. We've had, I think it's closer to 500, a little over 500. The time where we had the most active astronauts at once was during the shuttle era during the late 90s. We were sending up so many shuttles so frequently. At that point, we had, I believe, 150 active astronauts at once. And today we have about 40 active astronauts because we're just not sending as many people to space. In the coming years, though, with SpaceX, with all these other companies doing things, we're going to have a lot more people. So NASA's going to need a lot more astronauts. So. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. The question is is there increased cancer risk in astronauts because there's been so many of them and they've been up there for varying periods of time. And so in general, we limit the astronauts to a lifetime increased risk of cancer of 3%. We don't want their baseline risk of cancer to increase more than 3% than the general population. So astronauts that spend a year in space typically aren't allowed to spend another couple of years in space because they've reached that lifetime limit of radiation. There are some industrial workers here on Earth that receive more radiation than even them. Depending on where you live in the States or wherever you live in the world, the most common source of radiation on Earth, or damaging radiation on Earth, is radon gas. And radon gas is in everybody's basements. The deeper the basement, the more gas there is, and then there's a lot of radiation associated with that. So we haven't seen an increased risk of cancer in the astronauts. There's an increased theoretical risk, but it has never actually manifested. A lot of the astronauts are pilots, and pilots, by definition, do have an increased risk, and they typically get skin cancer more frequently than other cancers. So we have a couple astronauts that have gotten skin cancer, but they're also full-time pilots. So hard to say if that's from space or from pilot. Mm-hmm. How much do astronauts make? Not enough. So they are government employees, and they're technically paid on the military scale, and this is all publicly available online. The chief of the astronaut office, so the chief astronaut, he or she makes about $145,000, which is pretty good. But your run-of-the-mill standard astronaut makes about $85,000 a year. Yeah. They do get a lot of perks, like almost everything in their life is paid for. Their housing is paid for, their travel is paid for, food. But yeah, that's it. How likely is something like the Challenger to happen again? And so Challenger and Columbia were problems from were somewhat systemic problems, or systematic problems within the system. Part of it was some really good documentaries about it on Netflix and on YouTube that are out there now. But the problems were very unique to the space shuttle itself and some of the design, some things we've overlooked from a design perspective. And so, in part because of Challenger and Columbia, NASA is much more conservative now, and it takes NASA a very long time to do most things because we're focusing so much on safety now. And so you look at a company like SpaceX, which launches people to space all the time, and look at a company like NASA, who's been building this Space Launch System rocket for 10 years and only launched for the first time a couple of days ago. A large part of that is because NASA is so bent on safety now. So putting an actual percent number on it is very difficult to do, but it will always be greater than 0%, because you're basically putting a human on top of on top of an exploding rocket. You're controlling that explosion, but it's still an explosion. So there's always that risk. And all the astronauts, they know that risk, and we talk about it extensively with them, but it's never 0. It's not 10%, but it's definitely a real risk. Any other questions? I'm back.
You mentioned working with other countries like Russia. Like, how does that work with the political side?
Yeah, so nowadays working with Russia, it's, from a scientific perspective, it hasn't changed a whole lot. You might see in the news or on Twitter the head of the Russian Space Agency being somewhat antagonistic, or some people from the NASA side being antagonistic, but the actual day-to-day operations between the Russian Space Agency and the American one is virtually unchanged. The biggest difference is how we get in and out of Russia. We can't take the usual airlines. We usually take a private jet now, which I'm not complaining about. So, but aside from that, no major changes. Any other questions? That's not to me.
When you're on duty and you're monitoring the astronauts, are you monitoring all of them, or are you specific to one?
So if you're on duty mission control, you're monitoring everyone on the space station itself. On top of what you're doing mission control, you have all the doctors at NASA, we have astronauts that are assigned to us. So we are their primary care doctor on top of everything. So for their annual checkups, for any specialty care, like we take care of that as well, if they're assigned to us. But when we're working in mission control on the space station, we manage everyone. Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for having me, and I hope you guys learned something. Thanks for having me.